If you take a short break from your antidepressants, does that make them less likely to work when you start again? There are a lot of different reasons why people might actually just take a short break from using antidepressants. So, you might have packed incorrectly for your vacation. You might have had some sort of pharmacy snafu. You might just want a break in between antidepressants, or you might just forget because we're human and honestly, remembering to take something once a day is kind of difficult. Does that break actually mean that it's less likely to work once you want to start them again? And does it depend on how long the break actually is? So, researchers did actually a meta analysis. So, they looked at a whole bunch of studies that looked at people who had stopped using antidepressants for a period of time. And they were looking at this specifically because they're like, why haven't depression rates gone down? We've had relatively effective antidepressants in the 1950s, but our depression rates have actually been increasing instead of decreasing. Their theory is that it wasn't the antidepressants that weren't working that well, it was human error. So we just kind of suck at taking them, and that makes them less likely to work over time. Now, this is a kind of weird take on this. It's a little like victim blamey here, but like a scientific version of it. Like from a scientific perspective, though, it's not a terrible idea. So when you start taking something, your brain starts to adjust to that new level of things like serotonin or dopamine. So in antidepressants, it's typically like you have an increase of serotonin levels and your brain gets used to that. Now, once you stop taking it, your brain is trying to adjust to that not having it too. And so maybe in that adjustment, it's going to do something that makes it less likely to work the second time. I found that this is true. So once you quit using antidepressant, once you started to try to use it again, they actually had a higher level of non-response after that period of not using. So non-response meaning that you try to take it again and then you did not have any response to the antidepressant. Your depression was still there and the antidepressant didn't really work. Now, there's this huge problem with the data, and that is that like the length of time of those breaks was wildly different. So one of the studies was looking at things like 5 days, and one of the studies was looking at things like more than 2 years. And is that actually comparable? Is a break of less than a week comparable to a break of multiple years? Yeah, it's kind of hard to say that it is. Like in that study with the longer breaks, they found that up to 57% of those people had those antidepressants not work again. And in other studies, you saw that only like 4% of people no longer responded to the antidepressants. So like maybe a short break won't matter as much as a longer break, but we don't actually have the evidence directly comparing any of that. And then there's a problem with this too, and that like, what is ethical in this situation? So for example, there was one study that actually basically gave a placebo to people who were taking antidepressants, and they were randomly assigned into that placebo condition. So they were starting to take antidepressants, and then some of them were given a placebo for a period of time, and some of them were not. And then they were reassigned to those antidepressants again. So just by participating in this experiment, they might be less likely to have something work for them in the future. And that is a problem when they're in a study for things like depression, which is a severely debilitating disorder to a lot of people. So like, can we justify these studies in which we actually make people stop taking the antidepressant for a period of time, knowing that it might make them less likely to have something work for them in the future? I don't know. That's something for the individual review boards to figure out, but it is a very questionable situation. Now, they found that tapering, so instead of just like quitting cold turkey, which will give you some severe withdrawal symptoms, they found that tapering, so reducing the dose, that did not seem to help with the likelihood that that next round of antidepressants would work. So even if you did everything correct and like lowered the dose from like 20 to 10 to 5, that did not make it more likely that starting it back up again would lead to you having any sort of successful result. And you might be wondering, like, maybe you could just switch to a different type. So maybe you just made SSRIs not work, but maybe now you should try an SNRI and that would be okay. They've done studies looking to see about people switching to a different class, and it doesn't seem to matter if they're switching to a different class or they're switching within the same class. So it doesn't matter if they're starting a new drug that's also an SSRI and they just tried an SSRI versus starting an SNRI. Now, as far as I can tell, they have not directly compared like that lack of response rate the second time you start taking it. They haven't compared that among different drugs. So that part is still decently unknown, but based on the evidence saying that like switching between classes doesn't seem to do much of anything, it might be unlikely that that would help. So unfortunately, this is kind of where we've ended. So basically, we know that like if you have to take a break for one reason or another, that might make it less likely that that same drug will work in the future. And this is something that people need to consider before starting to take an antidepressant in the first place, or doing something like taking a hiatus for some reason. Like sometimes you have forced hiatuses, so things like pregnancy, that can make you need to or want to lower your dosage or actually just go off antidepressants. Now, there's this entire discussion about that, but that is one reason why people might want to stop for a period of time. But then that might make it more likely that that drug's not going to work in the next case. So when you need it after your pregnancy, for example, it might just not work at all. From a scientist perspective, we need to be doing the research to help with kind of the clinical guidance on this. And from a patient standpoint, y'all should be thinking about these things before starting to take something or taking a break. And as always, this is something you should be discussing with your doctor, because past use behavior might seriously change future use results.